Open this hearing of the Senate Community Affairs References Committee inquiry into the impact of microplastics and other toxics on human health. I begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and I extend that respect to any First Nations people who are here today. The committee will be conducting today's hearing via... We're not video conferencing, are we? No, via teleconference and in person. I'm Senator Penny Orman-Payne, and in the room I have with me Senators Ruston, Senators Brown and Antic will be joining us, and later Senator Askew. These are public proceedings being streamed live via the Parliament's website, and a Hansard transcript is being made. I remind all witnesses that in giving evidence to the committee, they are protected by parliamentary privilege. It's unlawful for anyone to threaten or disadvantage a witness on account of evidence given to a committee, and such action may be treated by the Senate as a contempt. It is also a contempt to give false or misleading evidence, and witnesses also have a right to request to be heard in camera. If a witness objects to answering a question, they should state the ground upon which the objection is made, and the committee will determine whether it will insist on an answer having regard to the ground on which it is claimed. If the committee determines to insist on an answer, a witness may request that the answer be given in camera. I remind senators of their obligations under the Behaviour Code for Australian parliamentarians to treat witnesses with dignity, courtesy, fairness and respect. And I remind committee members and witnesses who are appearing via teleconference today and who aren't speaking, if you could please mute your microphones. I now welcome Mrs Lucy Lyons from 2 Lines Fertility and Professor Rebecca Robka. I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses giving evidence to Senate committees has been provided to you. For the Hansard record, could you please state your full name and the capacity in which you appear today? And I'll start on my left.
My name is Lucy Lyons, Lucinda Lyons, and I am an ex-clinical embryologist, but now offering independent fertility guidance and support through my business 2 Lines Fertility.
I am Rebecca Robka. I'm a professor at Adelaide University, and I have specific expertise in female fertility and ovarian biology and pre-implantation embryology. I'm a biomedical scientist.
I'm going to invite each of you to make a short statement, and then after your opening remarks we'll go to the senators for questions. I'm just wondering, Grace, yeah, thank you. I'm just finding it hard to hear both things. So I'll start with Ms Lyons.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the committee for the opportunity to appear today. My name is Lucy, as I said. I am a clinical embryologist by training. I've worked in the IVF sector for more than 25 years, including working directly with eggs and sperm and embryos in IVF laboratories. I now work independently, supporting people navigating fertility treatment and reproductive health decisions. My work sits very much at the intersection of reproductive biology, environmental health and patient experience. Every day I'm working with individuals and couples who are trying to conceive, so I see firsthand that questions about environmental exposures are increasingly part of their fertility conversations. From a biological perspective, eggs and sperm are highly sensitive cells. They develop over several months before conception, and they're influenced by the environment within the body during that time. And because of this, reproductive health can act as an indicator of environmental stress. We now have evidence that microplastics and associated chemicals can be detected in human tissues, including placenta, which means exposure can occur during very critical stages of development. There is also growing evidence that some of these chemicals can interact with hormone signalling pathways, which are central to reproductive health. While the long-term impacts are still being investigated, what is clear from a clinical and patient perspective is that people are already concerned. Many patients ask what they can do to reduce environmental exposures before trying to conceive, but clear and consistent public health guidance is very limited. At the moment, much of our national conversation around fertility begins once someone is already struggling to conceive or sitting in a fertility clinic. Australia has invested significantly in fertility treatment, which is very important, but there is also an opportunity to strengthen reproductive health education much earlier in life, including awareness of environmental exposures during that critical window before conception. Ultimately, eggs and sperm are the raw materials that we use to build the next generation, and so it makes sense that the environment that those cells develop in influence their reproductive health. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Lyons. Dr Rodker.
Yes. Thank you, Senators, for the invitation and opportunity to speak to you today. My name is Rebecca Robker. I'm a professor at Adelaide University within the Robinson Research Institute. Our institute is dedicated and focused on improving human reproductive health, maternal and early life health. It's a collective of scientists, reproductive medicine specialists, pediatricians, epidemiologists, and public health experts. The namesake of our institute, Professor Jeffrey Robinson, was an obstetrician and a pioneer of the concept of developmental programming. And this is defined as the biological process by which early life events, including preconception and in utero events, how those events and exposures shape our physiology and our health throughout the rest of our lives. I'm a biomedical scientist. I lead a laboratory team that's focused on ovarian biology and early embryo development, specifically the first 5 days following fertilization. In particular, we study how different environmental conditions affect the cells within the ovary and how they affect the microenvironment that surrounds the egg, and the consequences of changes in the environment on embryo formation and subsequent health of that offspring on a cellular level. We've focused on how nutrition, obesity, and aging impact fertility, but events within the last several years have turned our attention to the urgent need to understand how PFAS, forever chemicals, are influencing female fertility and embryo developmental biology. PFAS levels in women are associated with early menopause, delayed conception, and in fact, PFAS is detected in the ovary fluid around the egg in women at IVF clinics. And I've put an example of that on the one-page simplified summary of our collaborating local IVF clinic, and that's been observed throughout Australia and globally. My lab recently completed a study that sheds light on the mechanisms by which PFAS may cause reduced female fertility. And in this study, we gave female mice PFAS at very low doses. In fact, we used doses that are identical to what's present in the tap water. And we comprehensively examined their eggs and embryos, and we found signs of cellular dysfunction. Importantly, we found that there was effects on the eggs and embryos detected in even the daughters and the granddaughters of the mice that had been exposed to PFAS in the drinking water. So again, this in a simplified manner is shown on the one-pager that I've circulated, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have about this or the more overarching topic.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Robker. And I'm going to go to Senator Ruston to kick us off this morning.
Thank you. Just in terms of some clarity for somebody who's not the same sort of level of expertise as you refer often to PFAS. Is there, what is the similarity in terms of other microplastics and forever chemicals, etc., as opposed to just PFAS? Is there evidence that they are similar in terms of their impact?
I'm really glad you've brought this up early in the conversation, because I feel like it can be overwhelming to people to think about all the different things that they hear about in the environment and all of the different things that they're trying to avoid. And Lucy can talk to that, but I guess I might say that on a cellular level, on a molecular level, there's similarities and there are differences. So they're very different molecules. So for instance, when we talk about endocrine disruptors, such as BPA, that is a molecule that mimics hormones or acts against hormones. And so it sort of tricks the cells into thinking it's getting exposed, for instance, to estrogen inappropriately, when the body wouldn't normally have given those cells estrogen. So those are endocrine disruptors which trick our endocrine system. PFAS molecules are a very different structure, and they're completely synthetic, man-made molecules. And They are engineered to be particularly to have these very unique properties that both repel lipids and repel water, and that's why they're really useful and have been incorporated into so many products. So they are anything that is sort of water resistant or grease resistant, and those are different. And we don't actually know how they particularly affect our cells. With PFAS, they are particularly unsettling because they bioaccumulate. And so we think that they actually enters the cells and they stay there. So that is a little bit different than endocrine disruptors.
Bodies don't have the capacity to break them down.
Yep.
And they're in anything, as Professor said, anything that has a waterproof or greaseproof property.
So
we're
packaging.
talking packaging, we're talking Teflon fry pans, we're talking
Upholstery.
watch bands, we're talking dry cleaning fluid, we're talking spray-on waterproofing material, we're talking Drysabones, we're talking, maybe not Drysabones specifically, but anything that has a waterproof or greaseproof property will contain PFAS chemicals, and our bodies can't break them down.
Okay, so back to my original question.
Yep.
So you've got, because we had an inquiry in 2024 into PFAS, and interestingly, reading the recommendations, I was quite surprised that the recommendations really didn't go terribly much to the human health aspect of it. It was actually more to the, trying to reduce the exposure more generally in, high impact things like fire retardant.
Yep.
But when you actually dig into the inquiry, there were some quite interesting recommendations. So I'm just trying to understand whether, well, to you, best of your knowledge, has anything come of that inquiry?
So I reference that inquiry in one of the programs that I teach and say that it's still not a lot came out of that with regard to public health type stuff, as you say, and it's a very difficult area because the research is not, we don't have enough research. We don't know the mechanism of action. We are learning more and more about the impact, but we don't know the mechanism. So then it's very daunting and frightening for people to think, there are over 10,000 chemicals in the PFAS category. It's not just one chemical. There are over 10,000 that sit in that category. So as an example, I get people saying, oh, but I've bought new fry pans. They say they're PFOA free. And I say, well, that's great. PFOA, nobody's used PFOA for 15 years. So people have been misled by greenwashing marketing and thinking they're doing the right thing, but because there are 10,000 chemicals in that category, they're not.
So to that end, is there any database or single source of access that would actually say, you've got a myriad of different chemicals, whether they be PFAS or microplastics, chemicals, etc., etc. And I'm assuming they're broken down into types, like talking about BPA or
Parabens, phthalates,
etc., where people can actually go and get some sort of understanding about.
No. In Australia, that doesn't exist. In the EU, there is a group who have identified and named over 1,400 known toxic chemicals that interrupt hormones. So they're the endocrine disrupt. That's the endocrine working group, and they have identified over 1,400 of them. They're working to make the EU EDC free. In America,
You're going to have to give us so EDC, endocrine
disrupting chemicals. So they're working to make the EU, the European Union, EDC free, so endocrine disrupting chemical free. So that's just one.
That's the
category.
1,400.
Yeah.
Yep.
One category of these environmental toxins. PFAS is another category, and there's over 10,000 that sit in that category.
Yep.
And understandably, again, from my perspective of dealing directly with people, they're just like, oh my God, that's all too hard. Everything's going to kill me one day. I'm not going to do anything. In Australia, there is no known database no single database. There is the AICIS, which is the Chemical Industrial, oh my God, what does it stand for? AICIS. That'll come back to me. But the AICIS lists all the chemicals in Australia that are available for commercial use, and there is a government website, and I'll have to put my finger on it for you and send it to you, that states that less than 25% of these chemicals listed on the AICIS have ever been tested for their effects on human health and safety.
Okay, so I'm interested to understand. So, I mean, obviously, you've got the first-hand experience of actually working with couples.
Yep.
Because fertility is clearly one of the bigger issues that we'd like to focus on here. So, is there any evidence-based or clinically proven ways that you can give advice to couples who are seeking to conceive about ways they can reduce their toxin exposure with any confidence?
There's no single source of that information. There are a lot of different sources that I have drawn from to give general advice to people, general guidance to people, carefully using the word advice. But there is no, to my knowledge, single source of that information in Australia, no.
Yeah. Because it seems like there's a growing body of anecdotal evidence that there's a concern.
Yes.
You've obviously done, and in some of the testing that you've done at your institute, but there doesn't seem to be that link pin that goes between what is clearly a body of evidence that's being built, but actually testing it in terms of presence here of these particular toxins and chemicals, challenges over here in terms of the disruption to particular systems. But nobody seems to have actually got the piece of work that actually brings the two together.
There are a few pieces, you've probably got something to say. There are a few pieces of work in that space, mostly based in mouse models. The reason is that it's unethical to do any kind of research on women and eggs. And this stuff is generational, and it's also, if you do a study on a single phthalate in a scented candle and see if that has an impact on someone's fertility, the answer will be no. But if you do a biologically relevant mixture of phthalates that a woman might be exposed to in any given day in her shampoo, body wash, blah, 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 on mice, there is absolutely a link there. So the way that I tend to view it is it's much like the climate change debates in the 90s. Now, I'm not old enough to remember that, when everyone was trying to draw causality between this is causing that. And there were a lot of people debating it. And at the time, there was also another group of people saying, well, you could spend the next 20 years debating that causality and making that link really clear, or we could look at what the suggested things to do are and just do them anyway. And that's kind of where I sit when I'm dealing with patients who are trying to conceive. If you're handing over $10,000, $15,000, $16,000 for a cycle of IVF, let's actually just reduce your exposure to plastics and phthalates and parabens and PFAS chemicals and whatever, and give that the best chance we possibly can.
Yeah, and look, absolutely understand that, but I'm just sort of trying to think, if there really is a direct linkage between these toxins and chemicals and the impact on fertility and obviously post-fertility, and obviously the babies themselves, we do need to, there is a responsibility to get some better evidence. Back in 2014, and I know it was specific to PFAS, but it sounds to me like we can probably talk generally in the same terms. There was recommendations were made about the establishment of, and I think they called it a national human biomonitoring program. So how does that fit in with what you've just said about the unethical study of humans, as opposed, because I mean obviously this is a human study, so how do they work together?
So there is one in Western Australia, which is the oldest database of human tissue in the world, I believe, or human, I think the West, oh my God, I reference it in one of my programs, but I can't remember the name of it. But in Western Australia, there is, at the university in Western Australia, there is a biobank of sorts, and they are gathering data over time. But by the time you get to, oh yes, this does actually impact the third generation as well, we're way down the line. Like the PFAS chemicals just keep being released out and they bioaccumulate, and they, you know, all these exposures are still happening all that time. So yes, that is happening, I believe, through the West Australian. I'll make a note to get that to you.
Yeah, no, that'd just be interesting because
I don't remember names of the study people like you would.
And I think it's really important to take advantage of these cohorts, and this is something we put forward in our recommendation, is that there are enormous biobanks. There are multi-generational biobanks that have been collected as part of specific studies for another purpose, but we could absolutely, should absolutely be using these to backtrack and learn more about exposures, because that is, it does need to be around transgenerational effects, and these multi-generational cohorts can do that, and we need better linkage systems that we've described around how people can access those, how there can be designated custodians of these really, really valuable resources, instead of depending on one single university or hospital to maintain them. And these human studies do take, they take decades, and they take decades to understand an exposure, because the health effects emerge later in life, and people will not necessarily be aware of the exposure they had when they were a teenager, or know the exposure they had when they were in utero, for instance. That's when the reproductive organs are forming. They form before birth, and during puberty there's massive changes as well. So, and humans are incredibly diverse, and there's gender differences in how people metabolize these different types of toxicants. There are differences around, body fat levels and things like that that dramatically affect how the chemicals are bioaccumulated in our bodies. And so humans are very diverse, and it takes enormous and very long-term studies to pull out these effects. But I think there are clear links, and the last thing I'll point out is one thing I think we can also learn from that we highlighted in our recommendation is paying more attention to our sentinel species that also reside in our exact same environment. We don't inhabit our environment by ourselves. And there are reports of decreasing sperm counts in dogs over decades and in specific environments. And so here's an example of animals that are with us in our exact environment, in our houses, exposed to the same types of air, water, and fabrics, and also eating lots of processed packaged foods. Yeah. And we can see in those types of sentinel species the exact same changes that are happening in men globally. And I think that's very good evidence that it's the environment that's changing.
Yep. Yeah, because it just seems to me from reading all of the submissions that we've received, there is a very strong view that there is a correlation, but no one seems to be able to put their finger on anything that's sufficient to say, actually, that particular...
But that's because there are thousands of these things that we're exposed to in everything we do, and the effects are felt over whole generations. So it's very, like I said, you can't just say that Mentos caused that problem. It's...
I'm getting that, but I suppose if we go to your particular area of expertise, which is sort of a little bit where the focus is happening, and that is reduced fertility.
Yep.
And I'm assuming it's happening on both the male and the female.
Absolutely.
Side.
Yep.
Dr. Robke, you made the comment in the submission, and I think it was something along the lines of that increased blood PFAS levels are associated with a reduced chance of conceiving good quality embryos. So you've made that correlation. That's a pretty definitive statement. So how do you get to that from what we've been talking about?
Yep. So in those clinical studies, which are published studies, and there's multiple studies, they have linked the blood levels of PFAS in women with earlier menopause, and there's been independent groups around the world that have done that. But again, as you point out, this is an association study. PFAS is probably a unique example in showing these associations because it does bioaccumulate. So your lifetime exposure will accumulate in your body and sort of hold a record of your exposure because we accumulated. And so those associations have been shown. Why does it cause increased earlier menopause? And same with the embryo studies. Those come from clinical studies at an IVF clinic where they can say, okay, well, the women that have higher level of these compounds, and again, they're looking at specific ones, but all of them go together as a cocktail. We can only measure what we know to measure. They can see associations with the women who have the higher levels, and they're less likely for their IVF cycle to form a good quality embryo.
And the clinical setting of that, when I talk to clients who've been through multiple cycles of IVF with no success, and then I put them through my detox program, and then they do a cycle of IVF and get 9 blastocysts in the freezer. Now, it's not a randomised controlled clinical trial that's been peer reviewed and published, but it's mounting more and more and more. 40 people went through my program last year, and I think we're up to 11 of them conceived after multiple cycles of IVF with no success, after reducing their exposure to these toxins through this program.
So the toxins you're talking about that you are reducing exposure to obviously are PFAS.
Yes, including PFAS.
But I think you said earlier on, once your body has PFAS in the system, it will not get.
And that's why it's such a daunting one, because everyone's like, PFAS, let's put that a little bit in the too hard category and approach the things we can approach, but also know where our PFAS exposures are and know that we can't do anything about what happened before, but we can swap out our cookware now to stainless steel, and we can swap out we can say no thank you to the waterproofing on or the treatment on our car, brand new car upholstery, and we can say no thank you to the fire retardant on our sofa and open our windows every day so we get less exposure to that stuff.
Yeah, okay. So I'm sort of interested in twofold here. Obviously, what you think would be the best steps to try and ensure that we have got the best evidence that we can to inform people's decision making.
Yep.
But the second piece of it is there a more generalised mechanism of information and communication to people for them to understand, better what the impact of their exposures are more generally? Because it sort of strikes me as that it's in that weird, wonderful space of is the science getting ahead of the public thinking, or is the public thinking getting ahead of the science?
So there was a website in Victoria called Your Fertility, which was a Victorian government-funded website, and they used a lot of the research from Dr. Mark Green. I don't know if you're talking to him when you go to Melbourne next week, but if you aren't, you probably should be. Yep. He's led a lot of the research into, he's also involved in the research in this space, and he has put together a few documents on the Your Fertility website about really patient-specific, patient-facing documents for people that they can easily follow, if that's kind of answering your question.
Yes.
Is how can we get that in front of the people who need it? And I think Mark Green's done a really good job of collaborating with the Victorian government to do that. I think the funding went away for that website, and it was shut down last year. I don't know if it's still sitting there archivally somehow, but he certainly provided a lot of the research for that.
What has been your experience in terms of the people, the manufacturers that use these products, in terms of their response to suggestions that some of the things that they're using are potentially having a detrimental impact on human health? Is there a reception to this that they need to do something, or is there?
I actually know exactly what their response is, because one of my clients is the CEO of a very big company that produces plastic packaging, and she sent me an internal email that they were sent yesterday after the release of the Netflix show. Have you seen that? Just got released 2 days ago. I haven't managed to see it.
So I've had so much time in the last 2 days, as you would well know.
Yeah, you've got plenty of time to sit down and watch Netflix, haven't you? It's called Plastic Detox, and it was released on Netflix 2 days ago. And
That's plain listening.
Sorry?
That's plain listening.
Could be. But it was released yesterday, and I'm going to read to you the email that was sent internally in the company about it, because I think it's worth doing. And answers your question exactly. If I can just find the email, there it is there, and it says, "Hi everyone, not sure if this information is already cascaded to you. A Netflix documentary, The Plastic Detox, is being released today. It looks at the potential health impacts linked to chemicals in plastics and follows people trying to reduce plastic exposure in daily life. It deals with issues like infertility. This will likely spark wider discussion about plastics and the role our industry plays both at work and in our personal lives. To help, please find attached high-level FAQs. If you do receive questions, it would be helpful to hear them. Your feedback helps us understand what people are asking and where more guidance may be needed. So they're worried.
Yeah, be interested to see what the...
I want to click the link, but I can't because it's a screenshot.
Yeah, well, maybe we should, yeah.
But I would be, they're nervous, and rightly so.
And one thing I think we can, 2 points I'd like to make is that it is difficult to advise people on what to avoid, and there's lots of things that they don't have control over. You know, we don't have control over the plumbing that's used in new constructions, for instance. We don't have control over
The glue that they use.
the glue that's in the
carpet.
flooring of your office. So there's lots of things we can't control. And so I think it is important to understand the mechanism of action of these molecules, that if we don't understand how they affect our bodies, we can't begin to counteract the health, we can't even contemplate how to counteract the health effects that are going to emerge. And also by understanding those biological effects, it provides a way to screen the next things that come along. If we understand how what we have now works, then when the next alternative comes along, we understand much more about how to say whether it is or is not safe.
And that's a perfect example because we learned about the impacts of BPA and we legislated against BPA, and now everything is BPA free, but instead they just use BPS or BPF, which are actually quite possibly worse.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you about that. So what was the catalyst that sat behind the banning of BPA?
You might know better than me.
I would love to tell you this story if you haven't already heard it, but you know, because BPA now is indisputably an endocrine disruptor, and its effects on female fertility were actually discovered accidentally in an academic research lab. And so in this laboratory, which was led by Dr. Pat Hunt, she and her team in Ohio, they were studying the ovary and egg development as they had for many decades, and all of a sudden they noticed ovarian abnormalities in their mice, in their research mice. They found that the ovaries had follicles with 2 eggs in them instead of 1, which is a developmental issue that happens in utero, and they found that the eggs had a very high rate of aneuploidy, which is when the chromosomes aren't aligned and it can lead to infertility and birth defects. They had no idea why this had suddenly started happening in their perfectly normal mice. Their investigations revealed that there had been a change in the type of plastic cage that their mice were being housed in, and that BPA, which nobody had ever thought of before, was leaching out of the plastic cages and causing these ovarian and egg abnormalities in the mice. And so this, I think, it's an example of how careful animal studies can reveal this really profound biology, and how we can learn from other species, and why it's important to do those types of animal studies where you can absolutely show an association, which would take decades to do in humans and be very complex.
So it's just interesting, you sort of, BPA hasn't been used for 10 years or however long ago. This accidental identification occurred, but if they're using
BPS and BPF.
Is there like, why hasn't something happened in relation to that, or is it, once again, they're just too many things that are...
There's just too many things, Anne.
Yeah.
And they're
It's
not...
just, there's just so many things, and I mean, when I talk to my clients about it, I say just get rid of plastic, like just don't use it. But that's a really simple blanket statement, and that's not going to wash widely. It's not going to shut down the plastic producers. Certainly shut down Tupperware.
Yeah, and often in the industry studies, they're not looking at reproduction, and they're certainly not looking at subtle effects on reproduction. They may be looking for gross level birth defects that you're not going to see unless there's a massive exposure, but they're not going to see subtle epigenetic changes that then lead to changes in potentially endometriosis onset, or changes in metabolism that lead that convolute and compound these issues. So they're not looking at the sensitive markers that we look at. And there's only, so in the reproductive system in particular is very, very sensitive. That's its job, to sense the environment so that it can inform that new conceptus about the world it's going to be born into. So the reproductive system is very sensitive, the brain is very sensitive, the immune system is very sensitive, and those aren't the things that are getting analyzed in the causal fundamental studies. And even in our study, where we showed these subtle effects on the embryo development and these damage markers in the eggs and embryos, but the thing that we also noticed that we did not report and wasn't our focus was the behavioral changes in the mice that were receiving the PFAS. They had anxiety, they were jumpy, and that was a profound thing that we could observe within days, was a behavioral change. But we went on to focus on the reproductive changes, but those aren't the things that the industry is focused on testing.
And I think if we put it in the broader context, which is kind of my job, you know, I'm dealing with these people who are being told by their IVF clinics that there's no causality and there's no point in doing, you can't do anything about egg quality, you can't do anything about sperm health, just do more IVF, which, anyway, that's a different story. But if I draw that back and look at the wider picture, I'm often in schools talking to young people because I can see this research coming and thinking yes, we can focus on the fertility things and the things in this space, but particularly with women's fertility, that all happens in utero. Women are born with all the eggs they'll ever have. So you can't actually change what's in the follicle of that ovary in a 30-year-old by doing anything, but you could change it in the reproductive potential of her child. So by cleaning up that stuff before pregnancy, then we're setting up the future fertility, the reproductive potential of the next generation. This is a multi-generational issue.
And I think we need to be speaking, I know you want to hear about what advice to give to people, human women, and because these events do happen in utero, I think it's very tricky to give women who are already pregnant advice about these types of things, because you do not want to alarm people and you do not want them to feel extreme pressure and guilt that it's somehow up to them and their own personal intake of these compounds, because the compounds are everywhere, as I mentioned, in things they cannot control, and so there needs to be a higher level of avoidance of them in our environment that's not up to the individual to try to control that themselves.
Thank you. I'm going to have to hand over. If there's any time, I've got more.
I'm going to go to Senator Brown, who's online.
Oh, hi, and thank you for your coming along and for your evidence and your submission to the inquiry. Now, it was a little bit hard to hear some of the responses, so if I repeat some of the ask for information you've already given, just let me know and I'll go back and have a look. So from what I'm hearing, there is, I'm trying to get to the point where Senator Ruston was talking about, and that was really about direct link to human health effects, and whether what I would like to know is there anywhere around the world where there are any human cohort studies?
Is that particularly around PFAS or any of the endocrine disruptors?
No, well, I'm particularly interested in any link with microplastic exposure to reproductive or development outcomes.
So there is definitely research that shows that microplastics are in seminal fluid. There is research that microplastics are in placental tissue, and there is research that microplastics are in follicular fluid, which is where the eggs grow and develop. And then microplastics will all contain BPA, BPS or BPF, and there's plenty of research showing the impact that they have on human fertility.
But you
And is that-
are correct, Senator, in that these large studies in humans, they are associations with amount in a person's body at that moment in time and a health issue at that moment in time. But for instance, with the clear association with PFAS levels and early menopause, we don't know if the association arose or why the association with early menopause has arisen. Is it because that individual was born with fewer eggs in their ovary? Because that, again, is something that is established by the time of birth. Or is there an accelerated loss? So we don't know the mechanisms from the human studies. We just know the clear associations.
So, and that's and that's what you've noted from the research that's been done in labs and your work with mice. Is that right?
The human cohort studies have been done, have been replicated in a few different places around the world in large clinical cohort studies. And the animal studies that I've mentioned, they are more mechanistic. They can look at the effects of the compounds on cells directly and modulate those in a controlled way to definitively pinpoint the effects. Whereas in the large human studies, there are associations between exposure and a health effect, but not mechanisms by which the compound is causing the health effect, if that makes sense.
Yes. So in the evidence that you've given today, and I think you actually mentioned it in one of the responses to Senator Ruston about national biobanks, and your submission recommends establishing a national biobank and data linkage systems. And is that because the current data banks are not sufficient? Because it's very difficult to hear, but they're not sufficient to answer the health questions.
Our recommendation was based on the fact that there's already many existing biobanks from clinical trials that have been completed and sometimes multi-generational trials. So for instance, in Adelaide, there's an enormous trial looking at maternal influences on susceptibility to type 1 diabetes. So there's enormous amounts of information that can already be utilized for studies about other environmental exposures. And so we are not starting from scratch in what we're suggesting. We are suggesting that there's better mechanisms to link different biobanks and cohorts, including these very valuable ones in Western Australia and in other places in Australia, so that those are linked and that they can also then utilize information, for instance, occupational exposure data and, for instance, other maternal health records. So better linkages of existing valuable resources that we have is a first step that could be relatively quickly and could give information about exposure timeframes and exposure effects.
You also called for standardised exposure assessment methods. Why did you ask for that? Is it because the methods currently used are inconsistent?
Yep. That is not my particular area of expertise, but I have colleagues who can speak to that in more detail. But yes, the methods need to continuously evolve and improve, and they need to be standardized so that if one study is measuring for instance, an endocrine disruptor, we can't compare it to a different study if they haven't measured them in exactly the same way. So broadly, that is the thinking, and my colleague in the next session, I'm confident, can answer that with a lot more detail.
I will. Who's that? Sorry, who should I ask that question to?
I would recommend Dr. Cameron Shearer, he is a chemist and can tell you more about the analytics and how the molecules are detected. Right, thanks.
Because obviously the follow-on question from that would have been around the ability to actually, with the inconsistencies that you just talked about, then it's about with our abilities to draw firm conclusions. But last question, sorry, is around the large-scale data sets. So the recommendations you'll put in there about harmonised data sets, that would assist in understanding the health impacts if we were to go down that route.
We believe it would, yes, because as just a hypothetical example, if you have a large biobank of breast milk samples that have been collected from a maternal and baby health study, we know that PFAS is readily detected in breast milk. Again, it goes to its properties of being a very lipo-associative molecule. We can understand a lot more about, well, where did the women live who donated their breast milk to this breast milk study? Where did they live? What type of lifetime exposures did they have? We already have tissues from them, and we also have health information as well. We would have maternal records about their babies or any fertility treatments like that. So we're proposing that there needs to be better interdisciplinary links using resources that already exist so that we can get information about exposures and effects. The exact type of information that I can tell that you're really looking for, we can get that information about exposure and effects relatively quickly by using resources that we already possess.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks, Senator Brown. I'm conscious of time, but I do just have one question that I'd like to ask. And I guess we've spent a lot of time talking about, trying to pinpoint causation as opposed to correlation. And I guess my question is, the precautionary principle would suggest that if we think there's a potential for harm, then we should do something about it, because we have nothing to lose by doing so. Certainly in the submissions it's clear that there's much stronger regulation in places like the EU, and I'm interested to know what you think are what are the blockers here in this country? Why don't we have the level of regulation, for example, that they have in the EU? Is it that we don't follow the precautionary principle here?
There's a lot of answers I could give to that, but I'm going to try and be as succinct as I can. I think we are many different states. We are a nation of people who like to make our own minds up. We don't like to be told what to do. So I think it needs to come from the ground up. I think we need to be educating and empowering people to make better choices themselves, which will then drive other things rather than regulating. In America, there is a list of banned chemicals. In the EU, there is a list of banned chemicals. In Australia, there is no national list of banned chemicals. So I think we need to look at this as a multi-generational issue, and we need to get into education and testing that precautionary principle. These are these things you could do easily that aren't going to hurt you and might actually really help you in the future.
Could I ask a clarifying question, though?
Of course.
From the evidence that you've given, it seems to me that placing the onus on the individual when there are so many things makes that a very burdensome
Absolutely.
activity. And I guess my question is, would we be better off not to actually regulate at a system-wide level so that people can take actions, but at least they're being helped at the broader level?
Right. So I was hopeful that you were suggesting that there should be larger efforts to basically prevent these compounds from coming into the country.
That's
Some
exactly
of
what
them
I'm
are banned,
suggesting.
but we do need to work at a larger level so that the public is not unintentionally exposed. So there's two, I think, very, very big issues that many of your submissions were calling for. That around preventing them from coming into the country, which we can really only do on an evidence base by knowing that they have toxic reproductive effects, and also by figuring out how to get rid of them in our environment.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you very much for your evidence today. Yes, we are. No, 9:45, and we started late, so sorry. Thank you very much for your evidence today. We could go on for longer, but unfortunately we can't. There was a couple of questions, I think, that were taken on notice in some information to come back to the committee with. So the committee will report to the Senate on the 26th of May 2026. Our responses to questions on notice are due by close of business on Thursday, the 2nd of April. So thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.
I now welcome Dr Cameron Shearer, Dr Nina Wooten and Professor Bronwyn Galanders. I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses giving evidence to Senate committees has been provided to you.
Sorry,
Yeah. Yeah. For the Hansard record, if you could please state your name and the capacity in which you appear, and I'll start on my left.
Nina Wooten, and I'm here as a marine scientist from Adelaide University.
Bronwyn Galanders, I'm the Dean of School of Biological Sciences at Adelaide University and a marine researcher.
I'm Cameron Shearer, I'm a lecturer in chemistry at Adelaide University and I do research in PFAS persistence.
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to invite each of you to make a short opening statement and then we'll go to senators for questions. So, Dr Wooten.
Okay. Hi, thank you all for inviting me to be here. My name is Dr Nina Wooten and I'm a marine researcher at the University of, well, now we're the Adelaide University, so we're still getting used to our name change. My research focuses on microplastic pollution in the environment and particularly how we measure microplastics in the environment, how they move through ecosystems and also their presence and effects on seafood species. I also do a lot of education and outreach in Indigenous communities and at schools, teaching young people about microplastics and marine debris quite broadly. So that's most of my research. I work very closely with Bronwyn, my colleague here, so she'll touch a bit more on the ins and outs. I lead an international collaboration working to standardise microplastic sampling and analysis methods in marine and coastal environments. And here's an area that is currently one of the biggest limitations in understanding the risks to both ecosystems and also human health. Microplastics are now recognised as a widespread and persistent form of pollution. We are exposed to them daily through the air we breathe, the food we eat and the water we drink. They have been detected in a range of human tissues, including blood, lungs and the placenta, and I'm sure you've heard all this from the previous session as well. A key point that I want to emphasise though is that our ability to measure and interpret microplastics is still very much developing, and there's currently a lack of standardised methods, particularly detecting the smallest particles, so more than nanoplastics, and also they're the ones that are most likely to interact with biological systems. So we're definitely limited from a methodological perspective. And this creates significant uncertainty around the levels and types of microplastics that people are exposed to and what that might mean for human health. Despite this uncertainty, there's definitely growing evidence suggesting potential harm, and early human and animal studies indicate links between microplastic exposure and impacts on cardiovascular, respiratory, digestive and reproductive systems. Importantly, plastics are not just particles, they are complex mixtures of chemicals, and Cam will talk more on this about PFAS specifically, but many of these chemicals are already well established to negatively impact human health, including fertility, development and chronic disease. And microplastics can act as carriers for these chemicals as well, particularly in the marine environment. So we do some work looking at microplastics in marine spaces and how chemicals can attach onto the surface of microplastics, making this almost chemical cocktail, we call them. Given the scale of plastic production and persistence of microplastics in the environment, reducing exposure through prevention is obviously critical. Recycling has a role, but addressing the full life cycle of plastics and stopping them being produced in the first place, in my opinion, is the most important way we can act on this. In the end, really, my view is clear. I think we need coordinated investment in research and particularly standardising methods and improving exposure assessment, alongside precautionary upstream approaches to reduce plastic production and also, of course, use of harmful chemicals. That's kind of a broad overview of what I do and where my perspective sits. But thank you, and I'm looking forward to having a productive discussion today.
Thanks, Dr Wooten. Professor Galanders.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this inquiry. I'm going to give a high-level overview of what our research touches on, focused on the microplastics, recognising that in my research group that we do a lot more than just microplastic-related research. So we've done a lot around what we actually find in marine environments, including in seafood, and the link into the human part would be through the consumption of seafood. So we've usually looked at microplastics. We have not touched on nanoplastics, which is a whole nother area, and what we actually find in seafood species that then might be consumed by humans, noting that we've tried where possible, and Nina's done a lot of this research as part of my group, we've tried where possible to put it into an international context. We've focused generally, initially, on looking at what we find in the gut contents of fish, with the premise being that if we don't find microplastics in the gut contents of the fish, then we're unlikely to find it in the tissue or the fillet part of the fish. And with some exceptions, generally we are not consuming fish whole in this country, so we're consuming the fillets or the cutlets, so we wouldn't be necessarily taking in that those microplastics that we're finding in the gut contents. But we've also examined crustaceans, things like crabs, as well as molluscs, oysters, mussels, cockles, which potentially pose a higher risk because they're filtering microplastics from in the environment. We've explored, as Nina started to mention, some of the key contaminants, things like PFAS, which Cam will mention more of, pharmaceuticals and pesticides, and the role that plastics actually play in their integration into marine biota. And that work's largely demonstrated that plastics may play a role in transporting chemical contaminants to fish. They act as vectors, for example, for PFAS transport, although at very low levels and for select compounds. There was relatively limited bioaccumulation onto the plastic surfaces compared to what we actually find in fish tissues that's coming potentially directly from the water. But there is potential for things like PFAS to transfer from plastics to marine biota, and then as humans consume the marine organisms, that's how it would be incorporated into humans. I think the key point there is that the system is incredibly complex when we start looking at what chemicals we're finding, what pharmaceuticals, what PFAS compounds, what pesticides we're finding in the water, what we're finding on different types of plastic, what we're finding in different biota, and it is an incredibly complex system. We really have very little research and monitoring that's been undertaken for microplastic contamination in any environments in Australia. We tend to see a lot more around seafood, and yet, as Nina mentioned, like just here there'll be microplastics accumulating from in the air. Your dinner plate will have microplastics potentially accumulating, your cooking surfaces and things. So a lot of what we're saying around seafood is applicable to any food source. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Professor Galanders. Dr. Shearer.
I'm here as a researcher specialising in the chemistry of PFAS. This includes the analytical chemistry tools used to detect it, and also the reasons or the chemical reasons for why PFAS are persistent and how they can be remediated from the environment. Per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, or PFAS, are not a single chemical but a large family of many thousands of synthetic compounds. They have delivered clear benefits to society through their use in firefighting foams, non-stick cookware, water-repellent textiles and grease-proof packaging. However, this widespread use has led to broad environmental dispersal. PFAS do not occur naturally, and their unique chemical structure makes them extremely persistent. Many PFAS bioaccumulate, meaning they concentrate in living organisms, including wildlife and humans. Governments worldwide, including Australia, have taken steps to reduce PFAS use and have established safe guideline values for soil and water. However, we are now observing toxicological effects at concentrations previously considered safe by agencies such as the various EPAs across Australia and our National Health and Medical Research Council, or the NHMRC. Many early Australian monitoring studies were unable to detect PFAS at concentrations below 20 nanograms per litre, and they typically only looked for less than 20 of the specific PFAS compounds. Today, our own NHMRC guidelines recommend keeping the level of PFOS below 8 nanograms per litre. This means that historical measurements of below detection limit may actually sit above that threshold value that's regarded as safe. Advances in analytical chemistry allow us to detect PFAS at far lower levels and across a broader range of compounds, revealing contamination that was previously invisible. PFAS exposure can occur through the water we drink, the food we eat, the cookware and crockery we use, and the consumer products we handle. Some exposures can be reduced through straightforward measures, such as preventing PFAS-containing straws, takeaway cups, and food containers from entering the market. Importantly, PFAS can be removed from drinking water using relatively simple and widely available filtration techniques. Contaminated soils can be washed and treated using similar principles. The major bottleneck of PFAS remediation is the destruction or transformation of these chemicals into safe or benign products. Significant gaps remain in our understanding of PFAS exposure, toxicity, long-term behaviour and remediation. These challenges span chemistry, toxicology, engineering, public health and environmental science, and will require coordinated, multidisciplinary teams to ensure solutions are practical, scalable and protect our communities. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thanks very much, Dr. Shearer. I'll start with Senator Ruston.
Thank you. To you, Dr. Wooten, you made some comments around methods in terms of being able to actually understand and measure micro and nanoplastics. Do you have a view about what would be an appropriate process to be undertaken to actually understand how we can actually get better methods? Because previous people who were here that you listened to, it seemed once again that they were making comments about the fact that, you know, we have this sort of belief, but there's no really defined method through which, or methods through which we can actually collect.
Yes, that's a really good question. So for the last few years, we've been working, Bronwyn as well, have been working with a group of Australian and also international researchers to try to consolidate the methods that we use to detect microplastics in marine and coastal environments. So it's specifically to that region because we're marine people. Although we also have as part of that looking at air. So for detecting microplastics in sediment, water, biota, and that covers a range of biota species, some of the ones that Bronwyn touched on, and also air. This process, it was, I will admit, the bane of my existence because it was quite difficult I had 40 researchers from 21 institutions, Australia and abroad, mostly Australian though. It was funded through the federal government as part of the NESP program, National Environment Science Program. And it was like an excellent process. We got what we need is to get all the researchers in the room to work together to understand different people have different methods. No one likes using another person's methods because they have long-term data sets or their laboratory set up in a certain way that is effective. We need to be able to all work together so we have methods that can be comparable, but very importantly, accurate. So this guideline has formed, and I can send it, it's quite a long, tedious thing, but if you would like to read it, I can send it through. And it's definitely applicable to broader environments. It is specific to microplastics, so it's not looking at PFAS or any of the other chemicals, because there's so many analytical methods that we could use.
I've got Dr. Shearer to talk about PFAS.
Yeah, so I just think my opinion on it is we just need to get scientists working together in the same room and realise that for the greater good we might need to make adaptations to our methods and hopefully work collaboratively across lab spaces as well, because the lab in itself is a very potentially contaminated environment, and when you get to the human health aspect, which we do not work on, but the labs need to be very, very clean and no contamination, like very specific.
So you gave us some examples about the different types of seafood, and I mean obviously molluscs as little filters are obviously going to be worse. But how significant do you think that the consumption of seafood is in relation to a pathway to human exposure?
Honestly, in Australia, really low compared to, like, this is a big message that we try to push. If you want to eat seafood, try to buy Australian seafood, because international seafood has a lot more microplastic, comparatively.
How can you tell? I mean, like, what would be the process to actually understand the different levels of exposure in terms of the seafood? Because, yeah, I think absolutely Australia is very clean and green, but unfortunately more expensive, which pushes people under a cost of living crisis. They're probably buying more seafood out of, the Vietnam Delta than they are Australia. So what information is there available to Australians that their exposure, and what is the significance of that exposure in terms of consumption of seafood?
So we've done a lot of work in this space. This is my whole PhD was based on this. So we sampled seafood from all over Australia and looked at the microplastics in their gut contents, and we've also done some work looking at the fillets, as Bronwyn said, which is a bit that's mostly consumed by at least Australian seafood eaters. Although caveat in that there are a lot of people who do eat the whole fish still, particularly if they're from international countries where that's customary. That's the way that they usually eat it. And I know Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders often cook the whole fish without removing the gut, so that's important to recognise. But we've looked at all over Australia, the microplastic levels, they're quite low. Like, maybe on average, like, I would say 30% of fish would have microplastics, but they're very, very small, and on average about 1 per fish.
Yep.
So when you think about the fact that apparently we breathe in a microplastic nearly every breath we take.
Yep. So how does that relate to international?
So, and then we've reviewed the global literature. I've looked at over 200 studies that use the same methods as us, and their oysters have 15 times more microplastic than Australian oysters.
Is that of significance, though, in terms of the relativity of the exposure?
I guess not significant if you compare it to other exposure routes for us.
Okay.
So I still think breathing and other sources of food and just other contamination is a much higher risk.
Okay, so to take that to the public face, do you think public perception in relation to seafood as a risk is proportionate in terms of the associated risk?
No, I think that the public perception, people presume that seafood is one of the worst things you can eat to have microplastics because of the messaging in the media.
Okay.
And that's a media issue, and we're really trying to debunk that. That's something we work very passionately in.
But that's something that's recognised internationally. So the UK and the US and Australia all had a symposium that Nina and I were part of, and a part of it was to demonstrate that seafood has had much greater focus in terms of research, and that perhaps it is a bit unfounded in terms of the bad messaging. You can get much greater human health benefits from eating seafood based on what's in it, as opposed to thinking about the microplastics.
Sounds like the Seafood Industry Association needs to be working more closely with you to get a better message out. So in terms of your research, do you do any research to sort of get an understanding about the evidence around the reproduction, growth, survival of species?
Of the seafood species.
Yeah.
So that's something that we're potentially interested in moving on to. Before we were actually going to start looking at those sorts of things, it was really important to actually know what we find in the seafood, because if there's nothing there and there's nothing significant, then there's no point in doing some of those further studies. So it's something that we're looking at moving towards.
Yeah.
I will say that I have worked, we just published a paper a few months ago that reviewed all the literature internationally that has looked at exposure of microplastics to seafood species and tested the effects on those seafood species. So there's over 1,100 studies globally that have done that. So there's a lot of research already out there that sets up a tank, has zebrafish, has salmon, whatever the species is, feeds microplastics and other contaminants, and then measures some kind of effect. And there's like 95% of those studies showed negative effects, and we can relate some of those model organisms potentially to humans, like with caveats, of course. But I will just say that the levels of microplastic and other contaminants that they expose these species to, as is commonly the way with ecotoxicology studies, are really high. So it's much higher than what we will be consumed. But precautionary principles, if it gets to that point, and we are also being exposed to that level, of course, we will also start to see effects the same as the seafood species are.
Yeah, okay. Just interested in your PFAS research, because obviously that takes it to the next level. So is your technology pretty much focused on ridding the environment of PFAS? It doesn't go to any way dealing with PFAS contamination of an individual?
Correct. Yes. So the work that I would do would help towards remediating PFAS from the environment, and not once it's in an individual. But of course, prevention is better than a cure.
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, it sounds like it's a pretty significant breakthrough, being able to. So, can you just give us a 2-second sort of summary of actually how it works?
So with this, is this the PFAS destruction work?
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
So the research that I do, we create light-activated materials.
Mm-hmm.
We shine light on these materials, they become excited, and then once they're in this excited state, they have enough energy to break the bonds which form the PFAS molecules. So the importance here is breaking the carbon to fluorine, which is the unique thing in the PFAS. And so we've had many years of optimizing our materials in order to drive this particular chemical reaction. And this is we've shown that this is possible at a lab scale, and we've also used it to break down like a PFAS contaminated source from a remediation site.
Okay, yeah, because we had that incredible situation where at the Air Force Base, didn't we, where there was a huge contamination.
Yes. There's PFAS. There's a significant amount of PFAS contamination at many defence sites and airports around Australia.
Yeah. So, based on your research, how widespread is PFAS contamination in our Australian environment?
Well, PFAS is detectable almost everywhere in the water. We, I think Professor Robka before provided a map that we worked together to create, where we looked at like the tap water at various sites and also some surface waters, and there was detectable PFAS levels. The PFAS detected is below our current NHMRC drinking water guidelines. And the other thing to be aware of...
That? I mean, do you agree that there's enough evidence for those NHMRC guidelines to be...
It's... So I noticed one of the questions earlier, so this is not my specific area of expertise. I observe that the safe drinking water guidelines seems to be different in various countries, and I find it curious that there's not an agreement between various learned societies that the safe drinking water level is not the same.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and I think that came out of the specific PFAS inquiry, but very strangely, the recommendations of the inquiry didn't seem to have anything to do with any human health, but nonetheless. So how far are you away from your technology or your research that would enable it to move to a more broad approach and use?
So I'm a university-based researcher. We can break down the PFAS. I suppose how far away we are would perhaps depend upon how much a person or a company are willing to pay for this process to occur. And so currently we are not economically viable as opposed to an alternative for PFAS waste at the moment, which I believe is either storage or landfill. I suppose both of those options have some potential later on effects, where if a PFAS is stored and these are spilled somewhere, they're back in the environment, or there's an accidental fire at these storage sites, then PFAS is released into the environment.
Okay, so your biggest barrier is a financial one?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Probably any of you to answer this. Recommendations were made about, setting up a national human biomonitoring program. I mean, do you have a view as to the usefulness that would have in terms of where you're going with your research?
Interestingly, I was at a conference, a plastics conference a few weeks ago that was hosted in Brisbane. And it was very good actually, very interesting. And they had similar kind of suggestions saying that it would be worthwhile to set up this sort of, I personally think we need like a cohort study to go over time as well, because I was speaking previously or listening previously to the previous presenters, and like obviously there's reproduction issues are one of the major things we're talking about here. The Barwon Infant Health, have you guys heard of the Barwon Infant Health cohort study?
No.
They're doing some work already on looking at, it's like epidemiological work over time. They've got 10-year data sets on tracking the mothers when they're pregnant and then the babies as they're born, and associated diseases. Also, this is all association related, as you heard from the so caveat. I think that's super beneficial because we need to have these long-term studies to understand the long-term effects. There's the same studies are being done overseas. There's one in Japan. I think there's one in Norway that have 15 years of data. We can utilise some of these things as well because these are international problems. Australia is not unique. Personally, I really think there should be a focus on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander as being part of these studies, because we know they already have other health issues, potentially different to Caucasian populations, and I think it's really important they're included, but that's me and my passion area. I do think it would be beneficial. These two might have more to add on that, but...
Yeah, I absolutely think it would be beneficial. We've got to start somewhere and start soon, or the sooner we start, the better. I think we need to put it into a broader perspective, though. It's not just about focusing on the human side of it, because if we're wanting to know where some of these things are coming from, it would be important to have the environmental part included as well. Yeah.
So I think, that was, to your point around, I think your research found that 70% of the coverage seems to be around seafood, and yet you're saying, particularly when it comes to Australian seafood, or even international seafood for that matter, it probably isn't necessarily the greatest contaminant. So through your research, have you been able to identify where the major food contaminants are coming for people's exposure?
So we haven't looked at a whole range of food sources. We've only focused on seafood predominantly, but we've been able to have a look at the literature and see what other studies have found, and that's largely what we've used in comparison to what we've found. But if you have a look at the literature, there's very little work even been done on things like beef, lamb, those sorts of things. So yeah, and then again, I think there's another point that besides what's actually in those organisms, what's coming in from, say, the way pet samples are processed, and that doesn't matter whether it's fish or beef or vegetables, and then how they're cooked, all those sorts of things. So there's a variety of potential routes of exposure that we need to be considering rather than just looking at the samples themselves.
Is there a place or space that would be a sensible sort of like central repository for the coordination of the research into this? Because as you point out, you're exposed everywhere. The previous presenters, made the point that the exposure often is completely and utterly unavoidable. You wouldn't even know that, the carpet was put down by a particular type of glue, or you're sitting on an aircraft seat or whatever it happens to be. Is there a place that you think would be best in terms of a central repository to try and design a research activity so that we could cover everything? Because it seems like there's lots of different organisations and people looking at lots of different places, all incredibly necessary, but who is best placed to pull it all together?
Yeah, this is a good question, because from the marine environment perspective, there's a centralised Australian depository set up by a CSIRO where you can put any data, like they need you to deposit all your data that you collect on microplastics in marine and coastal environments. That's nothing to do with this exposure of food. So similarly, we could set up something the same. I am a big fan of us collaborating more as a group. Maybe I feel like it's another question we won't talk about scientists not sometimes working together. But I think that there needs to be a centralised place where we can have all this data together. But then it's like we need to have the methods first that is going to make this data comparable. Because if, you know, researchers at Melbourne Uni are using some kind of detection method that allows you to get to a smaller level, and we're using a different method again, we just need to make sure we're all on the same page first.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose it all comes back to actually defining what is it the outcome that we're trying to achieve by this activity.
Yeah.
Clearly it is for human health benefit, but everything that sits behind that could be cleaning up the environment for the human health benefit, making sure that we understand what we're consuming for the human health benefit. But there doesn't seem to be any sort of central purpose driving it.
No.
So, because I mean, just as an example, like, you know, when you look at the marine life that you're studying, is there any evidence that the further up the food chain you get, the greater the prevalence of micro and nanoplastics are in that?
Like bioaccumulation.
Yeah.
There's some evidence, that it's moving up the food chain. We've done one study looking at that, and but it was on a small scale, localized, and there was some evidence. But globally, there is some evidence on that as well. Definitely with some of the other contaminants to do with not just the microplastics themselves, but the PFAS and other contaminants. There's probably more evidence showing that. Similar to mercury. Yeah. That's a well-known example.
Yeah, absolutely.
We should use the mercury, how they dealt with mercury as an issue actually as a good guideline for this, because that is so well known in the public and people are so aware of mercury as a problem in higher level species. And I feel like it's a messaging issue here.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, people can't make smart decisions if they don't have smart information.
Exactly.
Yeah,
and there's so much uncertainty, so it's a hard one.
I think just coming back to your earlier point, the National Environmental Science Program through their Sustainable Communities Waste Hub probably would be a good overarching, at least thinking about the environment.
Yeah. I think they put in the leaders of that, Veena, I'm going to butcher her last name, Sahawa something, from she works at UNSW in the SMART, they're called SMART something. They work a lot in microplastics. They put in a submission.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it just seems like as you read through all the submissions, you know, everybody is focusing in a particular area, but there just doesn't seem to be any sort of coordination about, you know, we've got a whole heap of data that suggests there might be some causal relationship between this and that, but no one's really pulled it all together.
Yeah. What are those, I'm going to get this wrong, the ARC grants that are that have lots of universities part of them?
Oh, you mean the Centres of Excellence?
Yeah, Centres of Excellence. Because there have been some plastic-related Centres of Excellence. But
there's been a CRC and there's been I'm trying to think what else there was. But they don't tend to be inclusive. They tend to be a smaller group of people.
Yeah.
And it's almost like you need an inclusive kind of group.
Yeah, like a higher level than that even, like a broader.
Yeah.
Because there's so many researchers doing such amazing work, but it's just getting us all together. I think.
Yeah, and it's then translating all that amazing work to actually make it useful to the public.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, through your research, Dr. Shearer, do you think Australians, like the regulatory standards around PFAS, actually reflect accurately the issue itself?
I think there's some gaps in the regulatory standards. The regulatory standards cover some specific PFAS chemicals. The NHMRC guideline lists 4 specific PFAS chemicals, but in the environment there are many thousands of PFAS chemicals. And so some of these can be almost chemically identical, except for one atom replaced with a different atom. And so its effect in bioaccumulation in potential human health would be similar, but it's not covered by these standards. So an alternative method might be to regulate these PFAS chemicals based upon the number of carbon to fluorine bonds they have. So instead of regulating a specific chemical, you could say if it has 6 or more CF2 groups, then it falls into this category, and the limit for that is some number.
Yeah. So, you know, do you think there's any need, or would there be coming up with a national strategy that actually umbrellaed PFAS as a group of chemicals, that there would be any value in actually pulling together a national strategy that actually said this is what we need to do in terms of exposure, this is what we need to do in terms of remediation, you know, these are the opportunities. Would there be any value in that?
I think that an area, so there would be an area of value to that, and also just to harmonise the system. So currently we're based on EPAs, and we have many different EPAs across Australia.
Yeah.
So a remediation company based in Queensland would remediate water to the Queensland standards, and then they would move to New South Wales and have to do their process in a different way in order to meet those other standards. Whether a government should be dictating exactly how the remediation is happening, I'm not so sure. More based, I suppose I would want the life cycle of the whole thing to be aware of, maybe not so much the specifics of whether they use this type of carbon or this type of membrane. It would be more the outcomes, and then being aware of what's going to happen with that PFAS waste. You take it out of water and then it's on this adsorbent material, whether there needs to be that whole life cycle part of the regulation.
And there's also that risk reward, you know, cost benefit analysis, in the sense of, sure, it's going to cost a lot of money to do what you're proposing, but, you know, what is the downstream benefit on human health and environmental health of actually not just chucking it in something and burying it in the ground, but you know, actually remediating in a proper way that actually gets rid of it.
Yes, yeah. I mean, the PFAS chemicals, if nothing's done, they will remain on Earth for millions of years, and accidents can happen. They can be leached into the environment again, and so.
I'm aware of time. I'm happy to keep going, but if you...
I might ask a question.
Yeah, go.
I'm happy to go back to you. Senator Brown doesn't have any at this point. I'm interested to know, in terms of level of investment and the amount of research that's going on in Australia, how, in relation to both microplastics, nanoplastics and PFAS, how do we compare to the rest of the world in terms of investment and amount of research going on in this area?
That is a very good question that I can't give you specific values on, because I think that would be hard to find out exactly. I feel like we're more up and coming than international locations, I would say that in a kind way. I think we're behind, like, in the seafood perspective, and I think this is probably a reflection of across the board then, because seafood was one of the first things that we started to look at microplastics in. Like, our first study was something that we did back in 2021, and that came out internationally. That was in 2008 or earlier, was when that started to kind of start coming out. It probably is across the board with other things. Maybe some of the innovative, like, methods of, like, what CAM does might have been earlier. I don't know if you have any ideas from it.
I think also one of the issues, I think, around some of these concerns is that it's almost like they don't want to fund it because they don't want to know about it. Yeah. And so that's certainly an issue that we found with some of our initial like grant applications, that were taking a very long time to even get an outcome, because and then they're worried about, okay, if you do pick up microplastics, what's the messaging? Because they get concerned that, you know, it's going to be, wow, credit card of microplastics in seafood or whatever. Yeah. And so I think that's more of a challenge in Australia. And similar to what Nina said, I'm really not sure the level of investment that's gone in overseas, but there's so many more studies being done internationally than here in Australia.
I provided a submission to the PFAS inquiry last year, which had some values here. So when the US EPA and US government announced new enforceable PFAS in drinking water limits in April 2025, that was coupled with $1 billion investment to address PFAS contamination. Australia has more recent, well, the Australian NHMRC has announced a new health advisory level for PFAS contamination, but there's been no joining announcement of some specific funding to address remediation. A lot of the work in PFAS remediation at the moment is kind of being developed by companies and they occasionally seek assistance from university-based researchers. That would perhaps be the main way that this type of work is funded at the moment, along with work undertaken by the CSIRO and at universities where we would be seeking funds from the Australian Research Council, but that is not specifically supposed to be funding of applied research, which is where a lot of the PFAS work would be.
Yeah.
So there's perhaps a gap between applied research and fundamental research, which is difficult to obtain funding for.
Thanks. Back to you, Sally Austin.
Just a couple more. Just interested, we've talked about PFAS, obviously, specifically. We've talked about microplastics. I think in your opening comments, it seems to be a less information around nanoplastics. I'm just keen to understand, from my own purposes and showing my ignorance here, like, what is the difference between a microplastic and a nanoplastic? I mean, assuming it's the size, but give me some real life examples around the difference between the two.
So we define a microplastic as 1 micron to 5 millimetres. A nanoplastic is less than 1 micron. So it's like really invisible.
So it'd be floating around in the air.
Yeah, floating around in the air. And it's the nanoplastics that we're more concerned from a human health perspective as crossing like the blood barrier. So they're the ones that we need from a human health perspective to know more about. The smaller particles can also have other, like it's easier for things to attach to them from a chemical perspective. Cam probably is better at talking about this than I, but surface area wise, things can also attach, so other contaminants are on there. It's mostly the size, but then the health impacts are to do with the transporting through the body.
Okay.
And also like the impossibility to see it. And I think like you're not going to go and pick up a piece of microplastic and eat it, but like there's so many nanoplastics that you have no way. Like this carpet, full the air, like the air conditioner.
So I'm just interested in terms of your research, particularly into the food chains and exposure in food. Is that largely driven by microplastics as opposed to nanoplastics?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So we've focused on the microplastics because we've got the ability to be able to measure them and and also to be able to account for any contamination that we might be finding. Nanoplastics is a whole different ballgame.
Okay.
And then nanoplastics is more controversial because that's where we're getting these like recent Guardian articles that have come out saying that we controversially, like some of the human health impacts, like the microplastics being found in the brain is also similar to another, I don't know the human health details of this, but looks like another molecule because it's really hard to tell the difference when they get this small. And the contamination is near impossible to avoid unless you have like a very, very specifically clean lab. So we just feel like in our research we can feel a lot more secure saying this is definitely a microplastic, and we polymer test everything, so we know it definitely is. But when it gets to a really small level, it's really hard to.
So hence the size makes it so much more dangerous.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So just on from a very broad level, where would you be recommending that policy focus? If we actually want to meaningfully reduce exposure to these toxins, is there somewhere you think would be a good place to focus?
So many places. It's all like through the chain. I feel like we need to have like plastic production, like the Global Plastic Treaty that failed, which I'm sure we're all aware of. Like that to me is number one, because otherwise we're just going to continue. You can't just keep doing what Cam's doing and remediating it. We need to stop producing it. And then that's the first step, because once we get that, at least we can deal with all the stuff we already have. I'm very passionate on the Global Plastic Treaty. I feel like that was such a disappointment. But then from an exposure perspective, I don't think we have good enough guidelines on all this stuff, but you need to know the risk before you can know the exposure guideline. It's kind of like a chicken and egg situation.
But I also think each state having its own guidelines doesn't always help.
No, it's very confusing for people.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And like Cam said, different things and doing it in one state and then moving to another. It's almost like we need a national kind of standard guideline, whatever.
Okay, national standards. Okay, that's a good suggestion.
Yeah.
Okay. Fantastic. That's me done. That was super helpful. Chair? Look at me, 2 minutes early.
I just sitting here thinking about what you're saying, and particularly the Global Plastics Treaty failing. I can't help but for me, it's like follow the money, right? Plastics are produced by fossil fuels. We're in a climate crisis. There's downward pressure being placed on use of fossil fuels for energy. And I'm wondering whether, there's a big push on then by the producers of plastic to keep that going, because it's another use for a fuel for a source of material that otherwise might be on the decline. Just wondering if you've got any reflections.
That's exactly what happened at the Global Plastic Treaty. They outnumbered, scientists were outnumbered 5 to 1 by fossil fuel producing nations who are peer pressuring, and Indigenous communities and Pacific Islanders, who are some of the people that are dealing with the brunt of marine debris and plastic pollution, were outnumbered 15 to 1.
But I also think there's a whole education component that's required here for the community, because I don't think many people would fully understand the level of fossil fuel involvement in plastics.
Yeah. It's confusing for people. But yeah, you're right. That is what happened it was pretty much a bullying exercise. Yeah. But the people, the scientists and the Indigenous communities did, they didn't fall over. They could have just sacrificed what they wanted to.
Yes.
I'm glad that they stood strong, and we're going to another meeting now, obviously, but it could have gone the other way. So it's a better outcome than it being less than what we wanted.
Yeah. When is the next meeting?
I believe it's sometime this year. I can't give you the exact date. I would love to go, but...
All right. If you have no more questions, and I don't think Senator Brown does, that brings us right on time. So thank you very much for your evidence today. The Senate will report on the 26th of May. I don't think there are any questions on notice.
I don't think
No, if there were, 2nd of April, but thanks very much for your time.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
And we'll suspend for morning tea. Thank you very much for appearing before the committee today. I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses giving evidence to Senate committees has been provided to you. For the benefit of the Hansard record, if you could state your full name and the capacity in which you're appearing today, and I'll start on my left.
So my name is Professor Ingo Köper, and I'm a researcher at Flinders University and part of the consortium.
Good morning. My name is Melanie McGregor. I'm an associate professor at Flinders University, and I'm leading the Nano and Microplastic Research Consortium.
Great, thank you. Now I'm going to give you both the opportunity to make some opening remarks, and at the end of those remarks we'll go to questions. So I'll start with Professor.
Can we start with Adelaide?
Absolutely.
So, as I'll just tell you a little bit about the consortium itself. So the NMRC, we call it, for Nano and Microplastic Research Consortium, was established by Flinders University just over 2 years ago. It started as just a grouping of research group at Flinders University spanning oceanography, biology, chemistry, polymer science, and nanotechnology. And so we got together to work in collaboration. Since then, we've grown quite a lot. We're now a national entity. We have partners in many different universities in different states, some of which you'll see at your Canberra and Melbourne hearing. And we also have many industry partners that we've started helping for analytical purposes or guidance. When they come up with solutions, we help them test whether these are working or not. We also have many partners that are from the regulation area, so EPAs and the like, with who we work and do research, but also happy to provide advice to these entities. Many of our members are also on Standard Australia Committee, working on the microplastic standard committee, but also plastic recycling, nanotechnology, and so on. And of course, we try to pass the message across, and so many of our members are quite active with the media, things like coming to talk to you, and so on.
Thank you very much. Professor?
So I'm by training a chemist, but I have been working for the last 25 years on membrane biophysics and probably for the last 15 years on nanotechnology, nanoparticles, and more recently on microplastics and nanoplastics. Flinders University had the first nanotechnology degree, which I coordinated for about 10 years. We stopped that degree about 4 or 5 years ago because there was no longer a big student demand, but I would consider myself an expert in nanotechnology. I know things, and I have looked a lot into the interaction of nanoplastics in particular with membranes.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Senator Ruston?
Yes, thank you. You make in your submission around the key findings, you said that particle size matters. So I'm just really interested to understand, does that sort of suggest that we should be focusing more of our attention on the smaller particles because they are clearly more impactful in terms of the impacts on human health? Is that what? So maybe I should take it back. That finding, where does that lead us to?
That's where the research that we've done with the nephrologists on these kidney cells and mouse model is telling us what we want to do next is keep looking at the smaller size fraction because we found that they seem to have not just a bigger effect but a quicker effect.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, because in your submission you say that nanoplastics are not biologically inert and how they interact with other cells and disrupting normal function. So in your research, what is your finding in relation to the kind of risk that poses to human health, and are there areas of greater risk that you think should be being looked at?
We're really at the start of this kind of investigation, so it's not easy to already point in the direction of greater risk. I think we just need to start chipping at it and really look into what cellular pathways might be affected by the different size, but not just size. Nanoplastic are also different polymers, and something else that we found is that you don't get the same results from the cells depending on which polymer you use, and that's why it's making it more complicated than some other chemicals. For instance, that it's one chemical, you test that one chemical. You can't test one nanoplastics. They're all different. And so it's a lot more to test. You test their size, you test their chemistry, their shape. They could be shaped like asbestos spikes. It's very hard to get across some that are shaped like that, like for model testing. But in the environment, we're probably exposed to some that are not perfectly round, like the one we can buy for our tests. And so this is big, just question marks. Like, my guess is that it can't be better when it's shaped like that, but we still need to test all of this.
Yeah.
I think the big problem is if you compare microplastics and nanoplastics interaction with biological matter is that you all of a sudden have interactions on a similar size scale. Right? If you look at nanoplastic particles, they are the same size as cell membranes compared before. If you look at just microplastics, for us as nanotechnologists, they're big. They're as big as a cell, so you look at very different types of interactions. What makes it really hard is that it's really hard to see the nanoplastics.
Yeah, absolutely. So, but there seems to be, I mean, do you have a view as to why nanoplastics have largely been excluded from our regulatory frameworks?
Because it's hard.
Like it should be.
Well, but so microplastics, sorry, you use a microscope and look at them. Nanoplastics are so small that under a normal microscope you can't see them. You need electron microscopes, which costs millions of dollars to actually look at them. So it's much more difficult to really look in detail what's happening.
Yeah, there's a lot of techniques other than microscopy that just don't have the detection limit to really tell you about nano. It can't tell you about one particles. You need things in much bigger numbers to just reach the limit of detection of the instrument. Like the technology, the one that can do it is not something that everybody get access to.
Okay, here's your Nanoplastics 101 question for the day. Explain to me, apart from size, is there any difference between a microplastic and a nanoplastic in terms of how they behave and what they actually are, apart from clearly they can transfer across membrane much easier because they're smaller, but is there anything different about them?
Do you want to start?
Yeah. So if you think about reactions or chemical interactions between any molecules and, let's say, a microplastic or nanoplastics, the interactions happen at the surface of the particle. So if this would be my microplastic particle, I could interact all over the surface. If I break this down into nanoplastic particles, I get a lot of different particles, which has way more surface area, which makes this then a very different types of reactivity that's happening.
Okay, so it is just size, but it's what that size...
it's surface area to volume ratio is really what the big difference is.
Okay. So in terms of, I mean, obviously the increased difficulty because simply the size is so small, but you've identified in your research that the impact appears to be significantly higher for the reasons that you've outlined. I mean, what is your recommendation in terms of where we should be going to from here in order to recognise the greater severity of the impact of nanoplastics?
Well,
what's the next step? What's the missing next step?
If we're looking at the effect on health, I think we probably awareness and maybe a bit of incentive for the research community to start looking at it. I think that it's coming. We've got lots of people in the nanoscience that are like, oh, okay, they need us. We're going to go and help with that because they've got the expertise. But it's not just that. Like, I really think we eventually will need some boost in instruments and capability, and we need people trained that have this kind of set of skills that can do it, because there's not that many of us.
Yeah, so I'm sort of interested in obviously the human health aspect of this is largely the reason behind this inquiry. So has in any of your work so far, and understanding you're only at the very start of it, shown or demonstrated any, I suppose, clinically strong enough demonstration of cellular disruption in relation to reproductive impact?
In relation to, sorry?
Reproductive.
Well,
too far away?
I'm working with nephrologists, so we're not looking at anything really reproduction linked. So not our group in particular, but I know there are studies starting and looking at reproduction from both the female and male side. There's a little bit more studies with just nanoparticles. And I think there's a lot of things that we found about nanoparticles, at least if it's just size related, that would transfer across. So if we wanted to know a bit more, maybe that's where we could start. Yeah. But no, not our specific research, no.
Yeah, because I mean, there seems to be a real lack of evidence in relation to the causation between what the anecdotal evidence that we're seeing versus to actually having any sort of proper scientific basis for saying this is actually having an impact on this. So, I mean, in your view, what needs to be done to be able to build that body of evidence that will enable there to be a much clearer connection between the ingestion of these types of plastics and, well, in the case of our inquiry here, I'm very interested in the decreasing fertility rates amongst men and women in Australia, and how we actually go about trying to identify whether there is any correlation between these plastics and that decrease in fertility.
So I think if this would be made on a political agenda or something that is it's important to look at, that would probably trigger more funding, or would tell the funding bodies, put this higher on your list of priorities, for which we then could apply for the funding and hopefully get more funding and do more research.
Yeah. Have you, in terms of the organisations that clearly are producing these particles, do you have any interaction with them from a research perspective, or are they just too far away from you?
So we have helped some environmentally conscious companies on the confidential agreements that have asked us to look at their waste, for example, wastewater, and to look at how much microplastics were produced in that. When we work with companies, usually they just ask about micro, not nano. And so we give them reports saying yep, it's that many folds more, or no, your mitigation step at this of your process is actually decreasing it by that much, and things like that. But that's as far as it's gone so far, I think, for that.
And I don't necessarily think that the problem is nanoparticle producers. We have so much plastics in the environment which breaks down to microplastics. Microplastics will break down eventually to nanoplastics. This is why they're there. So I don't think the issue is necessarily nanoparticle producers. It's plastic in the environment that breaks down.
Okay, so so do you think there's enough evidence now about the public health implications to actually justify or change the public health messaging in relation to plastics?
Yes. We just had Plastic 26 conference in Brisbane just a couple of weeks ago. That was organised by UQ, University of Queensland, and their members are partners on the consortium. It was about health and plastics in general, so not just microplastic, but also nanoplastics and all the chemical associated with plastics. I think the consensus from that conference is that there's enough evidence to warrant starting taking regulatory actions and not do the same as well. How long it took for other emerging contaminants like asbestos, lead, PFAS and so on. I think there's enough there to start taking action, yes.
Yeah. So just so from that sort of standpoint, where would you suggest that that messaging needs to start from? I mean, obviously governments need to be the ones that are designing the messaging framework, but where is the information that can be used to actually inform that message? Is there anywhere that has got some sort of central point of repository, or that you can actually go and get this information? Because from all of the submissions that we've seen, there seems to be a real concern that everything's very fragmented. People aren't working together, and yet, because we don't seem to actually have identified what is the problem we're trying to resolve in this whole space. There's lots of problems, whether they be environmental, human health, but that human health could be reproductive, or maybe other causes, etc., etc. So, you know, do you have a view about where a sensible place would be to try and coordinate everything that everybody's doing to try and see if we can actually get all of our focus going in the same direction, and instead of everybody operating in silos?
I mean,
it's a bit what this consortium is trying to do, to bring people together. It's not only people at Flinders, it is national, where we bring people together. Is there any? I think there's any.
I don't think there's any other national efforts. Internationally, that's really hard to do because, like you said, it's really like there's so much expertise in all directions. But at the national stage, being Australia, I think we're fortunate enough that there's not that many, so that we could try to concentrate the efforts. There's a leadership forum that's been formed on that as well, with some of the EPAs and department like DQ and so on, and we've been talking, and the Solving Plastic Waste CRC, this has got together a little bit as well with directions that should be taken, and we've been part of that. In terms of where to start, it has started. It's about consolidating. The different axes that could start being regulated could almost follow again, as that conference was broken into sessions, and somewhere about the materials and the content, simplifying plastic contents, listing of component and things like that. So that was one part. Then another part was about exposure and all the research about where humans get exposed, which way, airways. We don't talk about air enough. We're talking about what we ingest, but air is really concerning as well. And then there was like effects. And so those are different groups of people looking at it, but each of those I think could start living a bit on their own. It's easier to tell manufacturer, all right, from now on you really need to list everything you're putting in your product, even if it's just to give the consumer a choice. You can choose what you do and what you buy based on what's in it. That's not clear always, all the time. That feels like maybe a bit of a lower hanging fruit. Then there's some big advocates about asking for simplified formulation. Don't make plastic that complicated. We stick to the same 12, like the one that we know how to manage, or something. I mean, 12 is not enough. There's, thousands of them, but something like that. And then exposure, that's environmental health people would be more expert in that, and we need more of them in the consortium. But that's another field where we can help. We work with clinicians, they come to us, they're worried about people in emergency department, hooked to plastic lines and plastic bags for weeks on end, going straight into their blood. Like, that's next level exposure. There was a lot of talk about kids exposure because in a house, it's about you don't get the same exposure whether you're at kids' height and 2 meters high, like things like that. So there's different access, and I think there's people out there, and you'll meet some of them at your other sittings, that have quite clear idea of where the starting point could be. And being Australia, we're all very happy to sit together and do it as a team. So, yeah.
So, in terms of international experience, where do you think Australia rates in terms of its understanding? Because I'm assuming that the environmental factors that play into this mean that different countries would have different circumstances. But in terms of just addressing this issue, where do you think Australia sits in terms of the global landscape on this issue?
I'm not completely sure about addressing the issue. From the research point of view, I've been invited to a conference in Europe to talk about nanoplastics, and I was quite reassured to see that we're not lagging behind like 10 years. We face the same issues, we're at the same level, and we can help each other at the same level from that point of view. Addressing, I think Europe is probably leading. I'd like to think we're a bit more stringent than the US, for instance, on some of the chemicals. We're pretty good in plastic bans, I think. And there's some results from that already. I think people in Queensland are starting to see, for the microplastics, like some improvement from the beads being banned, from the straws being banned. So we start to have like success stories on those fronts. So from that front, I think we're pretty good.
Yeah, so I was going to say, you said you made mention of the plastic straws, and I know that a previous politician in South Australia was incredibly proud of the fact that he was the one who got single-use plastic straws banned in South Australia. Is there sort of a list of products that are high priority in terms of removing them from our marketplace, like single-use plastic straws, that we could start? There's going to be lots of things that are going to be much more difficult to get out of the economy, but there are things that are easy. Is there anywhere that there's sort of like somebody's done an analysis of what are the high exposure, high risk places? You made the comment about people in hospital, they're there because they're incredibly sick, and so what do? We sort of they're getting exposed to potentially another toxin. So are there things that are easy to do?
Well, there's lists of bans, and like there's a very picture that table in my head, like with all the different states, and they're chipping at that list of banning.
But they're not very consistent, are they?
No, maybe not, but it's aligning. It's getting there, I'd say, and it's more a question of like, yeah, that's easy, but is that the main culprit? Like that's a different question.
Yeah, so maybe that's the question. So
Yeah.
where does that? Where do you think the biggest culprit is in terms of
Tires, textile,
from
tires,
tires?
Car
and
tires,
textile.
yes.
The clothes and the tires are the number one issue.
And that's airborne, obviously.
Not just.
Yeah, and your carpet.
Carpet is terrible. Like, so bad.
Okay.
Can I ask
You're the chair. You can do whatever you want.
I know that, but you're on a roll. Just on that, you mentioned air, and I guess my question is, does a HEPA filter clear nanoparticles from the air, or are they smaller than that? And if not, is there anything that we have available that does clean nanoparticles out of the air that's operating anywhere? Because I guess one of the things that blew my mind is that we came out of COVID and we still don't have clean air standards. But it seems to be a related issue.
There are some types of nanoparticles that you can't filter out, whatever you do, because they're just too small, and it depends on the type as well. Nanoparticles, it's still a big range what we call nanoparticles. So the bigger nanoparticles, you probably can filter out with some filters, but the small ones, I don't see a way to really filter them out.
No, I'm more worried about the other thing the filters are shedding.
Yeah, okay. So that in itself is an issue as well.
Well, to be measured properly, but
Yeah.
like we're facing issue in the labs on that. We're trying to concentrate and filter things, and then you test, and the filter is putting more than what you are trying to look at first, things like that. So it's, not easy, but yeah.
So it sounds to me like what you're saying is we really need to be looking at sources.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And to come back to your question of what to address, and Melanie alluded to this, I think a big problem is plastics that are not just one type of plastic. Right? If you just have if you just have a PET bottle, you can recycle that, and we know how to do this. If you have a plastic where there's 5 different types in there, you can't really do much with it. So then that gets into a landfill, and that breaks down, and that becomes microplastic.
Can I just go back to one of the questions you had before as well about the nano and how different they are from micro, from the health and biological point of view? A nanoplastic is so small that for a cell, it looks a lot like a blob of protein or lipid or something that you wouldn't naturally come across. And so I don't think it's a far stretch to think they will potentially tend to take them in willingly thinking it's natural, and then it's seen and it's too late. So it's not just the size. The fact that the polymers are made of long arcing chains, you don't need to know that. It's the same as a lipid. From a biological point, a molecular point of view, it looks a lot like a lipid. So there's that as well.
Can I ask a very naive question? You talked about 2 of the biggest issues are tyres and clothing. Are there ways, do we have available to us right now the technologies to be able to manufacture those things in ways that would have less nanoparticles?
Okay, I know the tyres case. I'm not aware of ways to make them so that they don't shed, but I know that, for example, in Europe, they put a regulation called Euro 4, where they say as of 2028, tyres should not shed more than X, and then they put it onto the industry you go and find out, sort it out. By then, you're not allowed to do more than whatever. So the technology might not be here yet, but they put it onto the producer of the issue to sort it. And they have to put in the money and efforts to make it better. For the clothes, it's a tricky one. Making natural fibers suitable for clothes is also full of chemical process, so it's not as easy. But once again, there's ways of doing by putting the responsibility on the producer and the buyer, like the filters for the washing machines. We've got a little startups here in SA that's done that for South Australian washing machine. In Europe, it's compulsory from I don't know if it's this year or 2027 to have one on every washing machine. It's not in Australia, but you can buy them to fit them. So,
I mean, clothes is a different, right? Are you willing to pay the price to not have synthetic fibers in your clothing?
But it comes down to information, doesn't it, about,
Yes.
you can take a risk-based decision, but in the absence of knowing what that risk actually is and the consequences, it's very hard to make those decisions. It strikes me as we don't really have much understanding in the public. I mean, we heard from some witnesses earlier that there seems to be a level of sort of overreaction in terms of the toxicity from plastics from eating fish. Apparently they're incredibly low in Australia, and yet if you ask the average person in the street, the first place they'd go would be to say that it would be in seafood, and yet quite clearly, as you rightly point out, we should be more worried about the carpet we're walking on.
So can I ask a follow-up question on that then? You've mentioned a couple of things that are going on in Europe in relation to expecting companies to to come to the table, come up with solutions, putting things in washing machines. Has that come from a more knowledgeable public in that part of the world where people have put pressure on governments, or has that been led by government?
I have no idea.
Because I think that would be an interesting question for us to investigate, because is it public pressure, in which case you need a more educated public, so people here would need to understand more to place that pressure on government, or is it just that they're, for whatever reason?
It could also be that the scientific community has a bigger voice.
Yes, okay.
Yeah. We're running out of scientists.
So this is
experts.
So this is another flow-on impact of us depleting our research and development, depleting our scientific community and expertise. Yeah.
It's not just depleting, it's like
Pushing them out the door?
no, like the kids. Like
yes.
there's less and less that are interested in studying science. It's too hard or whatever.
I'm a former secondary school teacher. I have lots of views on why that is. Yeah.
I don't know what we're going to do when we run out of scientists and doctors. Like, that's, I don't know on which political agenda that needs to go, but it's a worry.
Yeah.
Yeah, probably the subject of another entire inquiry. How do we make sure that we're producing people who have the skills for the jobs of the future? But we might see that once the education. So anyway, look,
I'm very happy to come back for that.
Okay. I'm going to go to Senator Brown.
Thanks, Chair. And thank you for your submission and the work that you do. In your submission, you describe controlled lab studies using human kidney cells exposed to nanoplastics. Can you help the committee, or really help me understand how findings at that level, at the cellular level, translate to whole organ or whole body human healthy outcomes?
So doing cell study is the very first step. It helps us look at what the cells is meant to be in an organ, like if their primary function and behavior is changed at the cell level, then there's ways, and I'm not a biologist, so I probably won't explain that very well, but to then look at a bigger assembly of cells and then an organ and then towards the clinical. So it's the simplest model to see if there starts to be some significant changes following exposure. I should say as well, we're very interested in the kidney for a couple of reasons. Is that we know that we have nanoplastic in blood. Kidneys are meant to filter the blood. And so the base question is, do they actually get out of our body in mass, or are we accumulating them in our body over time because they cannot go through the kidneys? So it's questions like that that we're trying to answer with this research.
So far, do your findings demonstrate, where there's activity in the cells? So your findings that do demonstrate there's activity in cells, does that establish a clinical disease outcome in humans? Or
I don't think we can, from that, establish a clinical disease outcome, but I don't know what we need to do exactly to do so. Again, that's a question I probably should ask my clinician colleague to answer. Because,
I think what you can say, it's possible, but we don't have the evidence for that. If you wouldn't see any interaction at the cellular level, it's much less likely that there is an effect later down in a whole organism.
Yeah.
But you don't really want to do an experiment with humans and forcefully inject nanoparticles and see what's happening.
No. So, I think you did go into some detail with the questions that you've already been asked about the next steps. But if you don't mind, if you have, I'm sorry, but if you don't mind, can you just quickly put on the record again what next steps you would like to see in terms of the next part of research to be able to establish whether there is any direct, health outcome in humans.
So I think it's just a lot more research work that needs to be done, and probably not just by one research group, but several research groups, so then you can cross-compare results as well, and that would involve potentially more cell work, like work with just little cells in dishes, but also animal models, because we can't, like Ingo said, force the human exodus of plastics. Then there's like more population studies that also needs to be performed at much larger scales. And all of that is just a question of getting the means and the time to do so. At the moment, we're doing what we can with what we've got.
Yeah. So one of the issues that we touched on with the first panel today was, and you've highlighted it in your submission, is about the analytical detection methods for particles below 1 micrometer that are not yet standardised. How significant is this in assessing limiting how you assess real-life human exposure?
I don't think it's as much of an issue when we're really looking just at harms and human effect, in the sense that we're almost already a bit over the fact of just stating, oh, we found nanoplastic in blood, we found nanoplastic in kidney, we found nanoplastic in brain. Yeah, great. What do they do? If what we're looking for are the effects, then we don't need analytical instruments that are capable of detecting them that precisely. We use more common assays, biological assays, to look at biological responses to exposure. So it's a different issue. You don't need really to look at individual nanoplastics to answer these kind of questions. The field that really needs the analytical methods would still be everybody trying to make those, and I know it sounds weird, but we need to actually make the nanoplastics and make sure that what we're exposing the cells or the animal to is what we think we are. So we need a little bit of analytical strength there to say, okay, I've made in the lab nanoplastic that are made of PVC or polystyrene, and they're elongated and they're 20 nanometers in length. This is what I'm exposing my mice or pig or whoever like to. And it's not a big one, huge blob of spheres of something else. That's the two different things. Once we can tell what we're working with, then for the real human effect, I don't think it's that essential. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Yeah. So this really, my last question is around your recommendation, recognising nanoplastics as a distinct category of concern and taking a more precautionary regulatory approach. So how do you see, I'm just trying to understand, how do you see balancing that against the current level of evidence? What would you see? What would you like to see in terms of a precautionary regulatory approach?
To me, it's acknowledged that it is a potential issue, and that everybody acknowledges there needs to be more research done. But I think we need to publicly acknowledge we think there is an issue. We should look deeper into it, which I would hope.
And you think that the evidence, the current level of evidence, is there for that?
Yes, to that level, I'm very confident that we have enough evidence.
No, sorry, I shouldn't have interrupted you, but yes,
No,
so you would...
what I was going to say is that then would trigger, for example, the funding bodies to put this higher on their list of priorities, which makes it then easier to get actually the funds to do the work.
Right. Okay, yeah. I think you actually asked that question earlier now that I come to think of it. All right, well, I appreciate your responses, but also, again, I'd just like to thank you for the work that you do.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Does anyone else have any
Thanks.
more questions? No, I'm good, thank you. Can I say thank you very much for your evidence today? It's both incredibly useful and interesting. It's also quite alarming, I'm finding, but that is a good thing because people who are helping to guide government decision making should be across the issues. So thank you. We really appreciate your time. I don't think any questions were taken on notice. No? Okay, just checking because I had to duck out briefly. So the committee will report to the Senate on Wednesday the 26th of May 2026, and thank you very much again for your time.
Thank you.
Good luck.